Doctor Who since the early 1980s has had a hardcore fan following. A loyal fan following at that, and viewers who grew up with it in the 60s and 70s still watch today, and many are even quite active in fan communities. When a TV show gains this type of following, writers gain the ability to be far more self-referential than would usually be the case. This is because you have an audience who are interested enough in the show to remember a large amount of lore, even from episodes they may not have seen due to osmosis from other fans. Hence, when writers write a sequel to an older story, or even just reference something from a previous episode in Doctor Who, a large chunk of the viewership won't be confused as to what's going on. The trend of the use of self-referential material in Doctor Who has been growing since the early 1980s, and has become a fundamental part of the show. In my opinion, this factor is killing my enjoyment of the show, turning away casual viewers, and will eventually get Doctor Who cancelled. The story of this phenomenon, for the sake of this video, begins innocently enough in Season 19. The show is approaching its 20th anniversary, and it has successfully managed to transition away from Tom Baker's Doctor without losing too much viewership, and there are a lot of new faces now writing for the show. With the realisation of how dedicated a fan following the show now has, John Nathan Turner and Eric Sayward decided to include clips from stories that were about 15 years old at the time in Earthshock Episode 2. This would have been very exciting for fans at the time, especially those who'd been too young to have seen the 60s when it was airing, and have only heard about it from older fans. It did have a sensible place in the story as it recapped the Doctor's history with the Cybermen, which was probably needed as they hadn't appeared in the show for 7 years at that point. I can imagine the success of bringing back an old monster in Earthshock would have been something noted by JNT and Sayward, as for the 20th season of Doctor Who, every single story contained a returning monster or character. Arc of Infinity had Omega, Snake Dance had the Mara, the Black Guardian trilogy had the Black Guardian as well as the Brigadier. The King's Demons featured a return of the Master, as well as the 5 Doctors, recalling an astounding amount of different monsters, characters, and elements from previous episodes throughout the 20-year history. This had very mixed success, as many of the returns of prior villains felt a bit forced and out of place. Arc of Infinity doesn't really take Omega's story anywhere, and felt like he'd just been brought back because he featured in the 10th anniversary. And so that the production team could have a holiday to Amsterdam too, of course. The Master and the King's Demons has one of the most pointless plans he's ever had, to stop King John from signing the Magna Carta for some reason. This feels much more like something the meddling monk would do, but even then the story doesn't have much substance to speak of. However, from this point onwards, the references and random return of characters and plot elements from previous stories became commonplace. A good juxtaposition is comparing the clip scene from Earthshock to the scene in Resurrection of the Daleks, where every companion is cycled through on a screen in the middle of the story. In Earthshock, it was a nice one-off, which made sense in terms of recapping the audience's memory of old stories after a lengthy absence for the Cybermen. In Resurrection, it's tedious, goes on too long, and doesn't really have a good reason to be there. In Classic Who, this all came to a head during Season 22. Only Vengeance on Varos in that season didn't rely on returning characters or story elements, and this wasn't even an anniversary season. I feel like having so much returning in this season was a huge detriment to it in the context of the time. A new Doctor had just been introduced, and had a very dodgy start in the Twin Dilemma, which had left audiences conflicted. Rather than giving him some stories to really shine where he is the centre of attention, he is given so many recurring characters and plot threads it completely distracts from Colin Baker's Doctor. Attack of the Cybermen is by far the worst offender here, and is probably the fan-wankiest episode of Doctor Who ever. Bear in mind this is only Colin Baker's 2nd episode, and he basically spends the whole thing explaining how every part of this story links to every other Cyberman story ever made. It involves the plot of the 10th planet and Tomb of the Cybermen, as well as clearly cutting off bits of the invasion's skin and sticking it to itself, of all those scenes with Cybermen in the sewers. This is on top of the return of Totter's Lane from An Earthly Child, as well as the return of Lytton from Resurrection of the Daleks. Fucking hell, all of this lore is exhausting for fans. What the fuck are casual audiences going to think? They're all going to be so confused throughout. This isn't even mentioning the countless side plots which don't add up to a whole lot. On top of this, the casual audiences have all these random plot elements thrown at them, but will be asking themselves, why should they care about what's going on? And that's a good question to ask, as the only reason for their inclusion is to be crowd-pleasing fan wank for hardcore fans. There is little to no narrative justification, and it can be very exhausting to watch. Season 22 had a mixed reaction, but the show was put on hiatus by the BBC following the transmission of Revelation of the Daleks. The viewing figures would never recover following this, and while the hiatus was definitely the main reason, I can't help but think that many casual fans switched off at this point because the show was no longer being made with proper storytelling in mind. The focus in Season 22 seemed to have shifted to pleasing fans with returning characters and plot elements, to paper over the cracks of stories which couldn't stand on their own 2 feet. The last 4 seasons of Classic Who did avoid this type of storytelling for the most part, but it was already too late for the show, which was sadly cancelled in 1989. Russell T Davies, the man to bring back the show, clearly realised the rut that had caused the show to decline in both popularity and quality during the 1980s. The 2 main reasons identified are a lack of mystery surrounding the Doctor's character, at least until the late McCoy era, and far too much focus on the show's lore, to the detriment of both storytelling and viewing figures. To answer the first issue, he introduced the Time War concept, but to resolve the issue we're discussing today, he kept references and returning characters to an absolute minimum. This was a strong success for Doctor Who, as RTD managed to recapture the casual audience through telling new stories which were captivating rather than dredging out old lore in stories which would only make sense to hardcore fans. Yes, some villains and characters were brought back, but it was usually because they had a great idea of something to do with them. The Daleks and the Cybermen enjoyed successful returns in stories which re-established them on television, which divorced themselves from the complex lore which had been building around them in the 80s, and instead focusing on the core elements that made them captivating to watch in the first place. The ruthless evil of the Daleks is in full display in Series 1, while we get to see a conversion process and even a little body horror from the Cybermen in Season 2. I'm not without my criticism of the RTD era, or even some of the episodes I just mentioned, but on the whole, RTD did a really good job of keeping the show focused on telling its story, rather than obsessing over the show's own history. However, this was about to change as Stephen Moffat took over as showrunner in 2010. Things got off to a reasonably positive start. Although I'm not the biggest fan of the Matt Smith era personally, Series 5 was a success and largely stuck to a similar formula of keeping the show focused on telling a new story through a series arc, but with Moffat's own style of course. Series 6, however, is when the cracks begin to show. Series 6 was the peak of Doctor Who's popularity in New Who. While it was bigger in the UK during Tennant's final series, it had worldwide exposure here. While Series 6 too does largely tell its own stories, it is clear retrospectively that the elaborate plotline Moffat had set out didn't actually have a premeditated ending or resolution, and instead the audience were kept hooked by the implied promise that many more great revelations were on the way to make it all make sense. This didn't ever materialise, as shown by Time of the Doctor, which claimed to resolve the story arc surrounding the Matt Smith era, despite being very vague and leaving so many loose ends untied. As this plan of a grand story arc hadn't really worked, Moffat had to look for another way to make interest in the show, and this is when he realised the power of lore. When RTD brought the show back in 2005, Doctor Who had been off air for so long it was a necessity that it appealed to the casual audience, and didn't throw around too many references, otherwise the watching audience would have been confused and just switched off. By the time of the show's 50th anniversary, Doctor Who had built up a strong following again, with a lot of viewers being more aware of the previous adventures the Doctor has had, including the classic series. As a result, Moffat throughout his remaining tenure would not only revisit old lore, but change it as a way to artificially generate excitement among fans who were a little weary following the somewhat confusing Matt Smith arc. Let's go over some examples of this. First up is Name of the Doctor. In this episode, the Great Intelligence gets his revenge on Matt Smith's Doctor by spreading himself throughout his timeline and ruining everything he has achieved. However, Clara, the Doctor's companion, jumps into this timeline and corrects everything. This means that Clara is now responsible for helping the Doctor in the background for the entirety of the show's history. The episode shows Clara actually being the one who convinces the Doctor to choose his TARDIS when he leaves Gallifrey, as he gets in the one that doesn't fully work. An absolutely ridiculous change to canon, which gives an overblown sense of importance to Clara, which just isn't really believable. Although there were certainly critics of this move at the time, and even more today, it did cause some excitement in the Doctor Who community, and proved that additions or changes to lore like this were an easy way to stir up interest in the show. Moffat then repeated the trick, but in a much different way, in Day of the Doctor. During the RTD era, the ongoing character arc had been the Doctor getting over his guilt of killing all the Time Lords to stop the Daleks in the Time War. No matter what you think of this arc, it was well thought out during his era, and we see the character go through pain and grow as a result of it. In Day of the Doctor, all the Doctors are able to team up and stop Gallifrey from being destroyed because the War Doctor is spurred into action because Clara thought of the children. Okay, so that basically makes all of the character development that happened during the RTD era effectively meaningless, as Gallifrey was never destroyed by the Doctor. However, this tactic worked again for Moffat, who was able to use the old lore to easily generate the exciting and heroic moment he wanted in his 50th anniversary special. Later on in Series 9, the Hybrid story arc comes into existence. It is revealed in the story Hell-Bent that the Doctor didn't just leave Gallifrey because he was bored and wanted to become a traveller. It was because he was scared of the prophecy of the hybrids. Okay, well, that only changes the entire fundamentals the show has been based on since the beginning. What was so compelling about the Doctor's character is that he left a life of luxury and immortality because he had a great sense of adventure and wanted to help the universe out, and we enjoyed that adventure along with him. Now it all happened because of some grand prophecy which is never actually clearly explained what it is to this day, and the whole idea was forgotten over the course of the episode as it all becomes solely about Clara. Yet another change in the lore, which means we have to view previous stories in a different light, which for me makes them far less compelling. Then we get to Moffat's final episode in Twice Upon a Time, where it turns out the First Doctor had a whole other adventure just before dying in the 10th planet, where he is inspired by his future self to keep on going. Again, this is a whole episode centred around a lore change where none was needed, and it really doesn't feel like it fits in with the spirit of the First Doctor's era or his character arc. Of course, these are only the biggest examples. There are many more needless lore changes and unnecessary/obnoxious references. Here's a list of a select few which come to mind. The Daleks forget who the Doctor is from now on in Asylum of the Daleks. You can unconvert from being a Cyberman through the power of love. Clara being the one who inspired the Doctor as a child and listen. Having the Brigadier return as a Cyberman months after the actor who played him had died. The fact that Daleks are actually saying they love you when they exterminate. The sheer ridiculous amount of classic era Dalek props we see throughout the Moffat era for no other reason than fan service. And I'm in no doubt there are many other instances I'm missing. The point is, there's nothing wrong with reference now and again, but the Moffat era went way too far with its references and lore changes. It's one thing that most of them are very obnoxious in the way that they're written, but what makes them cardinal sins is the fact that they get in the way of storytelling. It seems that for the most part after Series 6, telling new stories was relegated to background dressing, in favour of that particular year's big lore change reveal at the end of the series. It isn't good writing, as this lore by itself isn't compelling. The only reason we have any interest in it is because we like Doctor Who. It wouldn't get any interest at all outside of this context, as it can't stand on its own 2 feet as a standalone story. As a result, we've seen a casual audience switch off, which started in the late Matt Smith era, and can we blame them? The show's became too much about its own lore, at least in its biggest moments, and if you're not that into Doctor Who, it won't mean anything to you, as it's not good storytelling in its own right. In 2017, Stephen Moffat left the role of showrunner, handing the reins to Chris Chibnall, who realised pretty quickly that a fresh start and a clean slate were needed. Almost everyone to do with making the Moffat era of Doctor Who was swept aside, and a whole new team of creatives were brought in with the task of giving the show a new start. As a result, Series 11 featured no returning monsters or characters, and almost no references to prior stories. In this series, the focus was on telling new stories with new characters. It looked like at last Doctor Who had let go of its past, and was ready to get back to what it does best, telling fun sci-fi adventures. There was one big problem with this plan. The episodes were mostly shite. As I explained in my Big Problem with Series 11 video I made about a year and a half ago, Chibnall had gutted the story arc format but kept the same episode structure. This meant that there were loads of self-contained stories who didn't have enough time to develop or focus on them to ensure quality, while also not having a linking arc to carry any interest. This resulted in the viewing fingers again dwindling back down over the course of the series, despite an extremely positive start in that department for the series. The lack of exciting stories made Series 11 a dank squib. Chibnall realised that this was an issue in Series 11, but rather than persisting with a self-contained story approach but with just a greater focus and effort into each story, he switched back to the old story arc system. And the story arc was, you guessed it, another Moffat-style mystery box lore change of the year arc dominating the series! Hooray! The BBC's own marketing department even went as far as to basically tell the audience that all the episodes in between Spyfall, Fugitive of the Jadoo, and The Timeless Children are a massive waste of time, and we should just get hyped for the finale instead. Fugitive of the Jadoo even felt like a Moffat story arc episode, in the vein of Let's Kill Hitler. Think about it. They're both a bait and switch, the bait being the characters featured in the titles, and the switch being a big so-called twist for the story arc. River being a Time Lord replacing Hitler in the story, and then the Roof Doctor replacing the Jadoo. It's just pure shock value with no substance to it. In The Timeless Children, the big lore change of the year is that the First Doctor wasn't actually the First Doctor, but was instead only one in the potentially limitless line of Doctors that came before him, and regeneration was actually an ability stolen from the Doctor, who fell through a wormhole to Gallifrey from an unknown location, and they got it by experimenting on him, and somehow they managed to keep this a secret for literally thousands of years. What? This sounds like the ramblings of an insane fan fiction. It's not like this was something that had been well built up for a long time, or even something which actually adds anything to the character, as Jodie just shrugs it off as not really affecting who she is after only a couple of minutes of the revelation. The revelation is told to the audience through PowerPoint presentation exposition by the Master. It is literally just an information dump of new things made up about the Doctor's past. I must ask the question, why should I care about this? I literally spent a whole series which was almost entirely focused on what the answer to this question, to the point where it overshadowed the telling of any new stories just for an exposition dump about yet another hidden thing about the Doctor's past. I'm absolutely sick of hearing all these things which we allegedly didn't know about the Doctor's past being stapled onto the side of this extremely overbloated and confusing lore that now exists. Exploring Doctor Who lore isn't fun. It's extremely confusing, with each new edition retroactively making different stories and character motivations less interesting or make less sense. This obsession with lore is not only poor writing, as we've discussed, it massively turns away casual viewers. Once they're gone for good, as they were during the McCoy era, the show may well be cancelled, and I fear that's something that's happening again now. To conclude, the message of this video is that Doctor Who needs to let go of its past, as constantly going over Doctor Who's lore every year is repetitive, uninteresting, and a really lazy way of trying to generate excitement. Don't we all remember what made us fall in love with Doctor Who in the first place? We love it because it's about fun adventures with interesting stories. We just don't get that anymore, as any story that tries to do that isn't the focus, and as a result always ends up being half-baked. Instead, the attention is always on more and more changes to the Doctor's past and the lore of the show. It isn't interesting and it's getting old. Doctor Who's big attraction that makes it unique is that it can go anywhere and do anything. Yet, we seem to revisit the exact same type of story every year since 2013. All I want are stories which are interesting and captivating enough to stand on their own two legs without having to use lore to artificially generate interest. But right now, we're the furthest from that we've ever been. I'm Lord Slar. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you back next time in another video.